The booing started before she played a single note, not after, not during, before she touched the keys, before she adjusted the bench, before she even placed her hands in her lap and went still. It started the moment she walked out from the left wing of the Harwick Concert Hall and crossed the stage in her plain navy dress, the one she had ironed twice that morning, and the sound that rose from the seats was not applause. It was something low and collective, like a tide pulling back from sand, and then a few voices hardened into it, and then more. And the hall, which seated 300 people on a Saturday afternoon in April, filled with a sound that was unmistakably, deliberately unwelcoming. Imani Sutton walked to the Steinway. She did not look at the crowd. She did not look at the judges' table along the left wall. She did not look at the woman in the third row front section in the cream-coloured blazer, whose expression was the closest thing in that room to satisfaction. Imani adjusted the bench. She set something small on the top rail of the piano just above the music ledge. A small wooden object, worn at one corner, cracked along the base. She placed her hands in her lap. She waited. What did Imani do when the full weight of that room fell on her? What did she play and what happened before she reached the last note? Before we get to that, we need to go back. We need to go back 12 years, to the house on Clement Street, to a small living room that smelled of lemon oil and old paper, to an upright piano that had been bought used for $200 in 1987, and to a woman named Cora who understood something about silence that most people spend their whole lives running from. Cora Sutton was Imani's grandmother. She was not a trained musician. She had no degree and no certificate, and nothing hanging on her wall except a calendar from the credit union and a framed photograph of her own mother standing outside a church in Mississippi. But Cora had something else. She had ears that caught music the way hands catch water, gathering it in for a moment before it slipped through. She had played piano since she was 7 years old, taught by a neighbour who had learned from another neighbour, a long chain of instruction that passed from person to person without ever touching a conservatory or a concert hall or a judge's panel. She started Imani at age 4. Not with scales, not with lesson books, with listening. Cora would sit Imani on her knee at the upright and play something slowly, just a phrase, and then she would stop and ask, "What do you hear? Not what note, not what key. What do you hear?" And Imani would sit very still in the way that small children sometimes do when they feel that the answer matters. And she would say things like, "It sounds like when you're almost asleep," or "It sounds like something waiting." And Cora would nod and play it again. There was an afternoon when Imani was 5 that neither of them ever forgot, though neither spoke of it directly until Imani was much older. Cora had been playing a slow, descending phrase from a song she knew from childhood, something without a name, a phrase she had carried her whole life the way people carry certain images or smells. She played it 3 times. Then she stopped and asked the question. Imani sat very still. Then she said, "It sounds like when you put something down that was too heavy." Cora did not say anything for a long moment. Then she said, "Yes, that is exactly what it sounds like." She played it once more, and this time her eyes were closed, and Imani watched her face and understood, without having words for the understanding, that the music had been telling the truth about something real. This was the lesson Cora taught. Not technique first, truth first. The metronome came from a box in the hall closet. A small wooden pyramid, shellac worn to bare wood at one corner, a crack along the base mended at some point with a strip of black electrical tape. Cora set it on top of the upright every session without explanation. Imani understood over time that it was not a teaching tool so much as a companion, something that marked time without judgment, something that kept going regardless. When Imani made mistakes, which she did constantly in those early years, the metronome continued. When she played something that finally unlocked, when a phrase that had resisted for 3 weeks suddenly arrived whole and clear, the metronome continued. It was the same, either way. This was something Cora knew and never said aloud. That time is neutral and what you do inside it is entirely yours. Those sessions lasted 2 years, every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, until Imani was 6 and Cora decided she was ready for what came next. Not a teacher. A library card. Let me take you back to that library, because this is where the story actually begins. The Clement Street branch of the public library had a music section on the second floor between the audiobooks and the periodicals. It was not a large section, but it had a complete set of Alfred's piano method books through the advanced level, and it had a listening station with headphones, and it had, in the reference catalogue, a list of recordings that could be requested through the county system and picked up within 5 days. Cora knew this because she had spent 2 hours on a Tuesday finding it out, and then she had written the relevant information in her small spiral notebook, and then she had taken Imani by the hand and walked her up the stairs. At the reference desk, she had asked whether a child could use the listening station. The librarian, a man with reading glasses on a chain, had said, yes, she just needed to know how to work the headphones. Cora had thanked him. She had then sat with Imani at the station and shown her how to work the headphones. She had also written down the call numbers of the first 10 recordings she wanted Imani to hear. She tore the page out of her notebook and handed it to Imani. She said, "Learn these, then ask the desk for the next ones." Imani was 6 years old. She held the list with both hands. For the next 4 years, Imani Sutton learned piano from library books and borrowed recordings and the upright on Clement Street. She had no formal teacher. She had Cora beside her on the bench twice a week, listening without comment, occasionally placing one finger on a key to indicate a note that had been struck wrong. She had the metronome. And she had something that can't be taught through a curriculum, which was the ability to hear a phrase of music and hold it inside her body until she understood not just what it was, but why it was. Why the composer had placed that interval there. Why the rhythm bent in that particular direction. The house was not a quiet house. Imani's mother worked 2 jobs, one at a dry cleaner and one at a diner on weekday evenings, and the house ran on the particular schedule of a household where time is always slightly short. There were mornings when practice happened at the kitchen table on a paper keyboard Cora had drawn by hand on the back of a grocery bag, Imani pressing silent keys while her mother got ready for work in the other room. There were evenings when Imani did her homework at the upright bench, not because it was comfortable, but because it was close to the things she would return to when the homework was done. There was a refrigerator that made a sound at night and a street outside with its own sounds, and through all of it, the metronome on the piano's top kept its time, ticking into the room whether anyone was practicing or not. By age 10, she was working through Beethoven's sonatas, not performing them. Living inside them, learning their architecture the way you learn a house you grew up in, knowing which stairs creak, which doors stick. Her hands had grown into the work. Her left hand had learned to be a foundation without being a floor, to carry rhythm without burying melody. Her right hand had learned patience. By 12, she found Ravel. Maurice Ravel's Gaspard de la Nuit is one of the most technically demanding works in the solo piano repertoire. It was written in 1908 as a deliberate attempt to surpass the difficulty of Balakirev's Islami, which had previously held an informal title as one of the hardest pieces ever composed. It is not commonly assigned to students. It is rarely performed by anyone under 20. Its first movement, Ondine, requires a specific kind of sustained shimmer in the right hand, while the left hand maintains a pulse so steady it becomes nearly invisible. Its third movement, Scarbo, is a controlled storm. Professional pianists who have played it for decades still describe something close to fear before performing it. Imani Sutton found it at age 12 in a recording she had requested through the county library system. She listened to it 4 times in one sitting at the listening station on the second floor. She sat very still through all 4 playings, the way she had sat on Cora's knee at 4 years old when something mattered. When the 4th playing ended, she sat for an additional minute without removing the headphones. She was not listening to silence. She was listening to what the music had left inside her. She went home and wrote the title in the back of a notebook she kept for exactly this kind of notation, and she made a decision so quietly that she never told anyone. She was going to play it. Not this year, not next year. In time. When her hands knew it, the way they knew Beethoven. When she could hear the piece from the inside, the way Cora had taught her to hear everything. She began that week, not with Scarbo, with Ondine, the first movement. She spent 6 months on the opening phrase alone, 40 bars that sound in performance, as effortless as light on water. The library had a recording by a pianist who had devoted 3 years to the piece and described his process in an interview Imani found in a music magazine from the reference shelf. He said the piece required a specific kind of surrender, that you had to stop trying to play it and start trying to be inside it. Imani read that sentence 3 times. She wrote it in the back of the notebook. She also wrote on the inside front cover in Cora's handwriting something Cora had said to her during a lesson when Imani was 8 and had stopped in the middle of a passage because she was frustrated. Cora had said, "Finish. Always finish. Whatever happens inside the piece, you finish it. The music doesn't stop because you're uncomfortable. It stops when it's done." Cora died on a Tuesday morning in February 2 years ago. Imani was 14. The call came while she was at school and her mother was at the dry cleaner, and the school counsellor brought Imani into the office and told her. Imani sat in the counsellor's office for 40 minutes. She did not cry there. She went home and sat at the upright for 3 hours without playing it. She had her hands on the keys once, and then she took them off and sat with her hands in her lap. She was not ready. The music was in her, but she was not ready to let it out. The upright on Clement Street went to a cousin, sold for $150 to cover part of the funeral costs. The metronome went to Imani. She kept it on her desk, not in a drawer. She did not start playing again for 3 months. When she did, she went back to the library. She was ready for Gaspar. She practiced Scarbo on a digital keyboard in her bedroom for 14 months. She had no teacher. She had the recording, the library score, and the notebook. She played sections of it every day for the first 6 months, learning the architecture piece by piece, the way you walk a dark room memorizing furniture. By month 8, she could play it through without stopping. By month 12, she could play it with something approaching freedom. By month 14, the piece did not feel like a technical obstacle. It felt like a room she lived in. She knew its corners. She knew its darkness. She knew what it felt like from the inside. She was 16. She was ready. Here is what you need to understand about the Harwick Conservatory Open Recital. It had been held every spring for 22 years. It was open, technically, to any young musician in the county between the ages of 14 and 19. The prize was a $5,000 scholarship and a seat in the Harwick Youth Symphony for the following season, which was the kind of credential that opened doors at regional and national competitions, that made college music programs take notice, that put a name in front of people who had the power to fund a future. The word open was in the title. It had always been in the title. Carol Whitmore had been on the selection committee for 11 of those 22 years. She had been chair of the selection committee for the last 4. She was not a musician. She was a patron. Old money, old associations, an endowment in her family's name on a practice room door. She believed in certain things about talent, about training, about what preparation looked like and where it came from. She had opinions about the conservatory's identity, the community it served, the impression it made on the donors and civic leaders who attended the spring recital each year. These beliefs were never stated directly. They operated through process, who received callbacks, whose applications were reviewed promptly, whose references were followed up on, what documentation was required from some applicants and not from others. Imani submitted her application in January. She listed her performance experience, which was limited. A church recital at 13, a community centre showcase at 14. She listed her training, which showed no institutional affiliation, no studio teacher, no conservatory name. She listed her intended piece, Ravel, Gaspard de la Nuit, third movement, Scarbo. She received a response 6 weeks later. The committee was concerned about the mismatch between her stated experience level and the complexity of her chosen piece. Had she considered submitting something more appropriate to her background? There were excellent pedagogical options at the intermediate level that would better showcase her development. The letter was signed by Carol Whitmore. The word development appeared twice. Imani read the letter once. She set it down on her desk beside the metronome. She read it once more. Then she wrote a reply. She thanked the committee for their concern. She said she would be performing Scarbo. There was a silence of 3 weeks. Then a provisional acceptance arrived, which was a category that did not officially exist in the recital's bylaws, and which had never been used before in 22 years of the event's operation. The recital coordinator, a man named Robert Adair, who had run the logistics of the event for 9 years and had a habit of writing everything down, noted the category in his records with a small question mark beside it. He sent Imani a standard confirmation. He also, in the 2 weeks before the recital, made several quiet inquiries. He asked the 2 piano faculty members he trusted most to listen to the recording Imani had submitted with her application, a phone recording she had made in her bedroom of herself playing the first 4 minutes of Scarbo. The quality was imperfect. The piano was a digital keyboard. Neither of these facts obscured what was on the recording. He asked the faculty members what they thought. They each responded within 12 hours. Their assessments were brief and identical in substance. One wrote, "This is extraordinary." The other wrote 2 sentences. "I don't know who this student's teacher is. She needs to be on this stage." Carol Whitmore did not know about these assessments. She knew about the recording. She had listened to 90 seconds of it. She had formed a view. The morning of the recital, 2 hours before the doors opened, Carol arrived at the hall in the cream blazer she wore to every event of consequence. She found Imani in the backstage corridor sitting on a folding chair with a metronome on her knee, running a finger across its cracked base. The corridor was narrow, lit by a single fluorescent strip. The sound from the hall was already coming through the wall, chairs being set out, voices of early arriving parents and sponsors. Carol walked to where Imani sat. She introduced herself and said several things in the measured tone of someone accustomed to framing cruelty as concern. She said that the hall's audience that afternoon included major donors and community leaders, people for whom the recital represented the conservatory's highest standard. She said that she hoped Imani had thought seriously about whether this was the right venue for her at this stage of her development. She said that the committee's original concern had been genuine and was still genuine. She said the word development twice. She said that there would be other opportunities and that she personally felt it was important for young artists to know their moment, to know when they were ready. Imani looked at her. She did not argue. She did not list what not explain herself. She did not list what she had done or where she had come from or how many hours were inside her hands. She looked at Carol Whitmore and said, quietly, "I know my moment." Carol held her expression for 2 seconds. Then she went to speak to Robert Adair. The conversation that followed lasted 4 minutes, in the narrow hallway beside the stage door. Adair listened to Carol without interruption. He was a careful listener. When she finished, he told her that Imani Sutton had been formally accepted as a participant in the recital, that her registration was complete, that her performance slot was confirmed, and that his job was to run a recital, not to revise its roster. Carol said that the committee's provisional acceptance had been issued for a reason. Adair said he had checked the bylaws that morning and found no provision for provisional acceptance in any version of the document going back to the event's founding. He said this without heat. He said it the way a person states a fact they have verified twice. He also said that 2 members of the piano faculty had reviewed her submitted recording and both had recommended without qualification that she be included. He said their names. Carol's expression did not change visibly. She said, "Amateurs sound impressive on recordings." Adair said, "Yes, sometimes." He did not say anything further. Carol left the hallway without responding. Backstage, Kezia Marsh was setting out the program order on the callboard, writing each performer's name in the conservatory's standard format, last name then first, with the piece and the timing beside it. Kezia had been a student at the conservatory for 3 years, studying voice, and had volunteered as a stage assistant for the last 2 recitals, because she liked the feeling of the hall from the inside, the machinery of it, the particular way a stage looked from the wing. She was not supposed to be in the wing during the other performers' warm-ups. She was there because she had seen Imani in the corridor that morning, had heard some portion of Carol Whitmore's voice through the dressing room door, had waited until Carol left, and had come to look through the wing door at the girl sitting on the folding chair with the metronome on her knee. Something about how still Imani sat had made Kezia stay close. At 1:45, 15 minutes before Imani's slot, Kezia came and stood at the edge of the wing. Imani was at the small keyboard they kept backstage for warm-ups, a silent practice keyboard, playing slowly with her eyes closed. She was not playing scales, she was playing Scarbo, or rather she was moving through it the way you move through something completely known. Not performing it, but communing with it, checking that everything was still there. Kezia stood in the doorway and watched the movement of the fingers, the way Imani's left hand pressed into its positions with a certainty that had nothing uncertain in it, the way her right hand covered the upper register in patterns so specific they had the quality of a signature. Kezia was not a pianist, but she understood what she was watching. She'd stood in the wing when performers came off stage after something true, and she knew the feeling of that truth before it was witnessed. She was watching something that had not yet been witnessed. She went and stood behind Imani when she finished. She said, "I heard what that woman said to you." Imani opened her eyes. She looked at her hands for a moment. "It doesn't matter." Kezia said, "It does, and it also doesn't change anything." She paused. Is there anything you need? Imani picked up the metronome from the table beside the keyboard. She held it in both hands. She looked at it for a moment, and then at Kezia. Then she said, "Open my side of the curtain at exactly 2:14, not before." At 2 o'clock, the recital began. 300 people filled the Harwick Concert Hall. The afternoon light came in flat and even through the high windows on the east wall. The program opened with a 15-year-old violinist whose teacher had been preparing her for 3 years. She performed well. Her intonation was clean and her posture was correct, and the piece she played, a Telemann Fantasia, was exactly the right size for the afternoon. The applause was warm. A cellist followed, then a flutist, each competent and schooled and known to some portion of the audience. Parents recognized names on the program. Board members nodded at titles. The hall functioned the way it was supposed to function. Nobody in the audience knew what was fifth on the program. At 2:13, Imani stood in the left wing. The metronome was in her left hand. She could hear the final bars of the piece before hers, a Schubert impromptu, clean and careful. She did not think about the crowd. She did not think about the woman in the cream blazer in the third row. She thought about a Tuesday afternoon on Clement Street. Lemon oil. The sound of the metronome starting. The way Cora had placed one finger on a key. The way she had asked, "What do you hear?" Finish. Always finish. Kezia pulled back the curtain at 2:14. The murmur started as Imani stepped into the light. She heard it before she was halfway across the stage, the specific sound of an audience reassessing what it expected, the shift from neutral waiting into something less neutral. She was not wearing the kind of dress that people expected in this hall. She was not preceded by a teacher who had spoken to the right people. She was a 16-year-old girl in a plain navy dress crossing a stage with something small in her hand, and the room had already decided something, and the decision was audible. By the time she reached the piano, it had sharpened into something unmistakable. A few voices at first, low and lateral, passing between seats, then more voices, and then the quality of the sound changed from murmur to something with an edge on it, something shaped with intention. The hall, which had applauded 3 performers warmly in the last 12 minutes, was producing a sound now that was not applause and not confusion. It was directed. Imani set the metronome on the top rail of the Steinway. She adjusted the bench, moving it back 2 inches to the position she needed. She sat. She looked at the keyboard for one moment, at the specific region of keys she would begin in, and then she placed her hands in her lap and went still. The room is not the music. The music is already in you. The room is just where you let it out. She let the sound be what it was going to be. It peaked, and then, finding nothing to push against, found nothing to feed on either. 283 people were simply waiting. 17 had made themselves known. Imani put her hands on the keys. What happened in the next 7 minutes and 40 seconds would be described afterward in different ways by different people in that hall. The parents of the violinist said later it was like watching someone speak a language you hadn't heard before and realizing partway through that you understood every word. A judge from the panel described it in his written notes as technically peerless and emotionally complete, and later told a colleague privately that he had not expected to feel fear during a student performance, and that what he had felt was something adjacent to it, something like awe's edge. A woman in the back left section said she had started crying about 40 seconds in and could not have explained exactly when or why. She told her husband that it was the left hand, something about the left hand, the certainty of it. 3 people in the front rows later said they had not believed what they were hearing and turned to look at the others around them to confirm that they were not alone in what they were experiencing. This is the part that cannot be adequately described in retrospect, because the thing that Imani Sutton played was not simply Scarbo as written. It was Scarbo as understood from the inside by someone who had spent 4 years carrying it in her body and 14 months living in its architecture daily. Her left hand held the ground with a certainty that felt structural, like a building's foundation made audible. Her right hand moved through the upper register with a precision that sounded, paradoxically, like freedom. The piece is about a goblin, a night creature that chases you in the dark and vanishes before you can name it. In Imani's hands, it was exactly that, and it was also something else, something that had to do with being inside a very small room for a very long time and then opening a door. At approximately 2 minutes into the performance, the last sound of disapproval in the hall went quiet. Not suppressed, not overridden. It simply stopped, the way a conversation stops when something more important begins. At 3.5 minutes, a woman in the centre section leaned toward the man beside her and said something he could not hear over the music. He shook his head, not in disagreement, in the reflexive gesture of someone who doesn't have words for what they are hearing. At 5 minutes, the piece reached its central passage, the section where the left hand drops to its lowest register and holds a chord so sustained it becomes almost architectural, while the right hand spirals through a series of arpeggios that ascend and then collapse back on themselves. Imani's body was perfectly still except for her hands. Her face was not performing. It was attending, the way you attend to something that requires everything you have. The metronome stood on the rail above the keys, still, not ticking. A witness. At 6 minutes and approximately 40 seconds, someone in the hall stood up. Stood. It was a man in the back right section, a parent who had come to see the cellist. He stood without apparent decision, the way people sometimes stand when something lifts them. Then, 2 people beside him stood. Then a section of the centre rose, where the board members and donors sat, where the people who had decided nothing before the first note were now deciding something. The standing spread through the hall in the particular way that genuine response travels, not in a wave from a single point, but in several places at once, as though multiple people arrived at the same threshold in the same moment, and the threshold was simply, "This is too large to receive sitting down." The standing ovation was full before Imani reached the final passage. She played the final passage anyway. This is the part that the judges wrote about afterward. This is the part that Robert Adair described to the 2 faculty members he had consulted, who had already heard the recording and were not surprised but were still moved. This is the thing Kezia Marsh stood in the wing and watched with both hands pressed over her mouth. Imani Sutton received a standing ovation before she hit the last note, and she finished the piece with absolute attention, as though the ovation were a weather condition and not a verdict, as though the room's response was real, but the music was realer. She played the final bars at the tempo they were written without rushing toward the resolution. She let the piece end the way it was meant to end, on a note that falls rather than rises, a disappearance rather than an arrival. The last note sounded. The hall held 1 second of silence. Then the ovation doubled. Imani sat for a moment with her hands in her lap, the way she had sat at the beginning. Then she reached up and took the metronome from the top rail of the piano. She stood, and she walked off the stage, and she did not look at the judges' table, and she did not look at the front rows. She walked the way she had walked on, with the same measured, unhurried pace that she had used to cross the stage when the room was making its noise, and she walked off in the same way while the room was making a different noise because the walk was hers, and it did not change with the room's temperature. In the wing, Kezia was waiting. Kezia put both arms around her without speaking. Imani stood in that for a moment. She was holding the metronome at her side. She said nothing. The deliberations took 35 minutes. Robert Adair brought the results to Carol Whitmore before they were announced. He found her in the lobby, standing near the window with a glass of water she had not touched. He told her that the judging panel's decision had been unanimous, that the scholarship had been awarded to Imani Sutton, and that the Harwick Youth Symphony's director had already come backstage and spoken to him about scheduling an audition the following week as a formality. He said the word formality and let it carry its meaning. Carol said, had the panel considered the applicant's lack of formal training? Adair said, yes. He said they had found it irrelevant to the performance they had witnessed. Carol said, the committee's process exists for a reason. Adair said, yes, it does. He said he had also spent the morning reviewing the committee's process in detail, specifically the use of a provisional acceptance category not found in any version of the event's founding documents. He said the conservatory's board had been informed. He said there would be a formal review before next year's event, covering the committee's composition, its criteria, and its authority. He said all of this without heat, and let each sentence land before speaking the next one. Carol set down the glass of water. She did not say anything else. She left through the side exit. The stage door. The scholarship announcement was made in the hall with the audience still present, people still on their feet or settling back into their seats with a specific physical looseness of people who have just experienced something that has released some tension they were holding without knowing it. The conservatory's director spoke for 4 minutes. He named every performer and praised each one. When he reached Imani Sutton, he paused. He said, "The panel was unanimous and immediate. What you heard this afternoon was a performance of Ravel's Gaspard de la Nuit, third movement, one of the most technically demanding works in the solo piano repertoire, delivered with a maturity and a precision that none of us on this staff have witnessed in a student performer in the 12 years this recital has been under our stewardship." He paused again. "The scholarship this year is not a close decision. It is a recognition." He looked toward the wing, where Imani was standing. "We are grateful she was in the room." Imani was standing at the back of the stage, just inside the wing's edge, visible to part of the audience. She heard every word. Her hands were clasped in front of her. The metronome was in her bag, at her feet. She did not smile when the director said her name. She did not look toward Carol Whitmore's empty seat. She stood straight and still and let the words settle into the room. And when the audience began to applaud again, she nodded, once the way a person nods when something true has been said. In the lobby afterward, people who had attended every previous recital said things to each other that they did not entirely have language for. The violinist teacher sitting in the second row with 30 years of experience listening to student performances was heard to say to nobody in particular, "Where did she come from?" It was not a dismissive question. It was the kind that holds inside it a genuine revision of what you thought you knew. Kezia received a letter the following week from the conservatory's director, thanking her for her service to the recital and inviting her to a formal advisory role for the following year's programming committee. She said yes the same day she received it. She framed the letter. She hung it on the wall of her practice room beside a photograph she had taken on her phone, backstage of the callboard with Imani's name on the program order. 5th, right where it belonged. The review of the selection committee resulted in a revised process, adopted unanimously by the conservatory's board 6 weeks later, under which all application materials would be evaluated by a panel of qualified faculty before the committee acted on them. Submission guidelines were revised to remove language about institutional affiliation. The provisional acceptance category was formally noted in the board minutes as having no basis in the recital's founding documents. Carol Whitmore's tenure as chair was not renewed. She was thanked for her service in a letter and was not contacted again regarding the event. She did not attend the following year's recital. Imani Sutton auditioned for the Harwick Youth Symphony on a Wednesday afternoon and was offered a seat before she reached the parking lot. The director called her himself that evening. He said he had watched a video of the recital, which a parent in the audience had filmed and posted, and which had, in the 48 hours since Saturday, accumulated a number of views that he found notable. He said he hoped she would consider submitting to the regional competition, whose application deadline was 3 weeks away. He said her story, whatever had happened in that hall, was something people needed to see. He paused and then said, "What matters most is that your sound is one I have not encountered in 20 years of running this program." He said that plainly as a statement of fact, and then waited. Imani said, "Thank you." She said she would submit the application. The video reached 2 million views in 9 days. The comments were too large to read in full, but the ones that came back most often were not only about the performance. They were about the moment before the first note, the way Imani had walked across that stage while the room did what it did, the way she had set the metronome on the piano rail and placed her hands in her lap, and waited, without argument, without visible hurt, without a single gesture of apology or accommodation. Several thousand people wrote some version of the same thing. I have been in that room. I needed to see what she did in it. The practice room that Imani was assigned at the conservatory for the summer season had a small card mounted beside the door in a plastic sleeve, the kind used for room numbers and teacher names. Someone on the administrative staff had printed her name on it in the conservatory's standard font, last name then, first, with the season below. She noticed it the first Tuesday she came in. She stopped in the corridor and looked at it, at the name on the card in the plastic sleeve beside the door of a room in the Harwick Conservatory. She went inside. She set the metronome on the windowsill where the afternoon light came in at a low angle and turned the old wood warm, and the cracked base and the worn corner and the strip of black electrical tape were all perfectly visible against the painted white sill. She stood looking at it for a moment, the way you look at something that has been with you so long it has become part of your body's memory. Then she sat down at the piano. She did not play Scarbo. She played the descending phrase Cora had played on the upright when Imani was 5 years old, the one without a name, the one that sounded like when you put something down that was too heavy. She played it once. She played it again. The third time she played it all the way through without stopping and let it end on the note where it ended, and sat with her hands in her lap in the quiet room on a Tuesday afternoon, with the metronome on the windowsill and her name on the card beside the door. Here is what I want you to hold when you walk away from this story. The room in that hall did not give Imani anything she did not already have. It could not. You cannot give someone 12 years of Tuesday afternoons in a room with an old metronome and a grandmother who asked, "What do you hear?" You cannot give someone Ravel from the inside. The room's noise before she played was real, and the room's silence afterward was real. Both were real. The difference was that one of them was hers before she sat down. The biggest mistake is never being underestimated. It is believing the people who underestimate you. There is someone right now who is building something in a room nobody thought to look in. Building it from borrowed recordings and library books, and a metronome on a windowsill, and everything a grandmother pressed into their hands before she left. The credential they don't have is not the thing. The thing is what they have instead. The question is not whether they have it. The question is whether you will be in the room when they let it out, whether you will still be standing. If this story sat with you, pass it on to someone who needs to hear it. Tell them. Finish. Always finish.